Okay, now we're going to do part 2. Sorry we have moved. And by part 2, I mean we're going to talk about lungs. This is my anatomically correct drawn lungs. Isn't it great? Yeah. Okay. So the first thing we're going to talk about is why we are called negative pressure ventilators, which is really cool. So the basis of that is I'm going to attempt to draw this. So is it pressure? No. Frick. That's going to be in video now. Basically, pressure, this is the sign for proportional, and I'm going to draw an X. What that means is pressure is inversely related to volume. So as pressure goes up, volume will go down. Or as volume goes up, pressure will go down. Cool? Great. So, I'm going to erase that. Understanding that principle is really important for the lungs. So on your lungs, you have two membranes. One is called the visceral pleura, and the second one is called the parietal pleura. Really important. The outer membrane, so the parietal pleura, is what's stuck to your rib cage. So I have here, there's our ribs. This red line represents our parietal pleura. And that's just kind of stuck to the rib cage. This blue line that I have represents our visceral pleura, and it is literally direct in contact to the outside of the lungs. So they're essentially the same thing. So the cool thing is you normally have some amount of fluid in here, but you also have lymph vessels. And what those lymph vessels do is they pull out all of that fluid constantly. And so that creates a suction force. So that keeps your parietal pleura nice, tight, and snug up against your visceral pleura. So it keeps your lungs kind of stuck to the side of your rib cage. Because your lungs, I like to think of them in terms of a rubber band. You stretch them and they go back. That's what we call elastance.
Yes.
So think of it like, an elastic. You stretch it, it goes back. That's your lungs. So, but the problem is I have them here and they want to go in, but they can't. It's the only way that they change is if I go down. And this red line here represents our diaphragm, for those people who like to spell correctly. Or if you want to pronounce it correctly, you say diaphragm. Right. But diaphragm. So, if I pull the diaphragm down, and fun fact, these are also like lungs, diaphragm. Lungs, diaphragm. They kind of literally go together. Like, I'm not even kidding. In cadavers, you can't really tell the difference between like where the lung stops and the diaphragm starts.
Right.
Unless they have serious lung issues. So, if I lower the diaphragm, I like saying diaphragm. It's more fun that way. So I lower the diaphragm. We're going to go here. It contracts, becomes more straight. What did I do to the area here? I increased my volume. If I increase the volume, my pressure decreases. When I decrease the pressure, I become negative pressure compared to outside.
Right.
That pulls air into the lungs through my trachea and into my bronchioles, and then into my lungs.
Of course.
So that's why we're called negative pressure ventilators, because as we expand the volume of our lung cavity, we decrease pressure, then outside pulls air in. Negative pressure ventilator.
Okay.
Super cool. Okay. The next thing that we're going to talk about is what a pneumothorax is. Pneumothorax is really bad. Basically what happens is you puncture one of the pleural membranes. So if you puncture this, you no longer have a negative pressure in your intrapleural space, keeping the lung tight against the rib cage. Mm-hmm. If that happens, the elastance, or the rubber bandiness of your lung, overcomes that pressure. And then we'll draw it on this lung. We'll go to how it would want to be in a very sad little bag state. And it's kind of like that.
Collapsed lung.
Collapsed lung. Really bad. So that's a pneumothorax. We puncture either of the membranes. So this could have been like, I punctured that membrane instead of the outside one. Yeah. Either way, it removes that negative pressure from the intrapleural space and makes the lung collapse. It's like you're holding a rubber band tight, and then say it breaks. Okay. And then it's like useless.
Yeah, makes sense.
Why did I cap that? Okay. We're now going to erase the lung.
Oh.
But we're going to keep my fun little bulb.
You need an eraser.
My thumb works just fine. Yeah, it works just fine. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to talk about is surfactants. We're going to talk about surface tension. And the first thing we're going to talk about is something called Laplace's law. Oh. Cool. Oh my gosh. Good enough. It looks like a smiley. I just realized that. Okay, so Laplace's law says pressure is equal to 2 times the tension, or surface tension, divided by the radius. It's really weird looking at it on this screen because it's flipped.
Okay.
Anyway, so as I increase the radius of something, the pressure drops. In the case of these two alveoli, when air flows in, it will flow from an area of high pressure to low pressure. The pressure in here is lower than the pressure in there because this has a bigger radius. So this is a really big problem in our lungs. If you have one alveolus that is bigger than another, it's just going to keep filling up the big alveolus. And so the blood that's to that other one is just not going to get oxygenated. So we needed to figure out some problem to solve this. And we do that by messing with T.
Okay.
So your alveoli have a little layer of water. And actually I'm going to use red for this one. So you have several forces that are working on the alveoli trying to make them collapse. That's what makes up the elastance of the lung. So you have some force of the alveoli. It wants to collapse it on itself. Oh my gosh. Who is calling me? It's my cousin. Hang on. Continuing onward. So the way that we deal with this, so we've got some kind of elastance force trying to pull it in. We also have water. Water makes surface tension. The really interesting thing is, so we're going to draw a cup here.
No way.
And it's full of water. You add a bunch of water, it ends up bubbling like that. So each water molecule is exerting force all over the place. Water molecules at the top are exerting force everywhere but outside of the water. So the really interesting thing is we have a really, really thin layer of water here. What that causes is an overall vector of force in. So it's also trying to collapse the alveolus. So we have a bunch of stuff that is trying to collapse the alveolus, trying to make R smaller, reduce. Really bad. No bueno. If it's small and compressed, we can't stick air in there. So we need some way that we can stick air inside the alveolus. So we have to overcome those issues. So what we do is we add a surfactant.
Which is tea.
Or soap.
Ah.
Or basically anything that is hydrophilic head, hydrophobic tail. So what that does, we're going to use...
So like half a cell membrane?
Yeah, that'd work. So basically what we do is we add a bunch of little surfactants, and that breaks up surface tension. So that starts changing this. Radius doesn't change really much. But the cool thing is per area of the alveolus, in the bigger one, we have less surfactant per area. But in the small one, we have more surfactant per area.
Which makes sense.
So we increase T significantly higher. Just kidding, we decrease T. Decrease tension because we're getting rid of surface tension. So pressure drops really far. So this actually ends up being lower pressure than that one.
Mm-hmm.
So then you breathe in, this fills up, and then we can expand our alveoli equally. Great. Super useful.
Of course.
Okay. So that's that stuff. Whoop-de-doo. Okay. Gosh, it's so hard to see. Explain how CO2 is transported in the blood. Okay. We're going to talk about gas exchange now.
Me too.
Actually, first we're going to talk about hemoglobin. Okay. This is a red blood cell. HB stands for hemoglobin. I mean hemoglobin.
I see.
I mean hemoglobin. Anyway, so hemoglobin has two different states. So we're going to draw this. This is an iron molecule that is in the middle of the hemoglobin. And when it's like this, it's bound to O2. Or, same thing.
Wow.
Cool. Perfect.
That's a double A pattern.
I am now only going to use red and blue. This is going to be a great lesson. So, hemoglobin, it sits in two different states. This state where it's connected to oxygen is called the R state, for relaxed. In this state, the iron is kind of pulled down slightly, kind of like you're getting ready to slingshot it. And that's called the tensed state. It's bound to an amino acid called histidine. Super useful. Gets it ready to bind to oxygen. What makes it be in this state is usually the binding of CO2. So CO2. When CO2 binds to hemoglobin, it will pop off the oxygen and turn it into the tensed state. When oxygen binds to the iron, it will turn it into the relaxed state and pop off the CO2.
Yes.
Really cool. So, great. That's gas exchange. So, now we're going to draw. So, just so you are aware, we pull carbon dioxide as a byproduct of cellular respiration. So, there are several ways that we carry CO2 in the blood to eventually get it to the lungs. Here's our blood. We carry some of it bound to our hemoglobin. That's what that means. We also carry some of it as just like gas that's just diffused in our blood plasma.
We're talking about CO2 stuff?
Yes. Okay. CO2. I'm actually pretty proud of that too. The other part, so hemoglobin has carbonic anhydrase. So that turns CO2 and water into bicarbonate. So we have CO2 plus H2O. And that turns into HCO3 minus plus H plus. And so 70% of the carbon dioxide in our body is actually maintained as this bicarbonate that comes from the carbonic anhydrase that is within our red blood cells. The other 20% is done, and you can leave it open, I don't care.
Are you recording something?
Yeah, but it doesn't matter.
I'm going to be talking all the time.
All right, fine. Okay, so the other about 23% is CO2 that is bound to hemoglobin. And then the other 7% is gaseous. There's a chance that I switched those two numbers, but 70%, the majority of it is carried as carbon bicarbonate within our blood. Okay. O2, on the other hand, is almost the same. We're going to use red to describe O2. So O2 is, whoop-de-doo, diffused in the blood, and interestingly enough, that only makes up 2% of the oxygen within our body. The other 98%, boop, is bound to hemoglobin. So each red blood cell has about 1.2-ish million hemoglobin. And each hemoglobin can bind to 4 oxygen. So one red blood cell carries like 4 to 5 million oxygen molecules. And you have a lot of red blood cells. Like, you get rid of and replace 2 million each day.
Yes. You have a lot of atoms in your body.
Yeah, a lot. Like, a lot.
I understand.
Great. So that's what happens here. So that's how O2 is transported in the blood. So now we're going to talk about more gas exchange stuff and how that works. Actually, that will be the second part. So now we're going to talk about what's called an oxygen saturation dissociation loop. Oh, also when hemoglobin is in its tense state, we call it deoxygenated hemoglobin. And when it is in its relaxed state with oxygen, we call it the oxygenated hemoglobin.
Of course.
Right? Makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. Oh, there's another really cool thing. So in red blood cells and in your placenta, because you have a placenta, there, as you go through glycolysis, you turn a glucose molecule, which is a 6-carbon molecule, and you eventually break it down into a 3-carbon molecule, 2 or 3 carbons. And carbons at each of the end, so we're going to draw carbon, carbon, carbon. So each one has a phosphate group. There's a special enzyme in red blood cells and in the placenta that breaks off that phosphate and sticks it onto the second carbon. So instead of being a 1,3 BPG, which stands for biphosphoglycerate, so BPG, we like to, I was about to say elaborate things, but we like to abbreviate things.
Excellent.
So in red blood cells, they do this. What this does is hemoglobin has anatomically correct structure, as drawn by Brother Shaw yesterday. There's a little hole right here that we describe as magic, where this molecule fits in perfectly and it makes it easier for each of the hemoglobin to enter into the R state. So it's easier for oxygen to bind to them. So really important. Okay. So that's another thing that deals with oxygen transport. Okay. Now we're going to talk about that fun loop. So percent sat means how much of your hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen. The PaO2 down there means the pressure of the oxygen within your arteries. So arterial oxygen pressure. So the really interesting thing is that loop ends up looking something like that.
Okay.
So, and this is around 102 millimeters of mercury. And then it doesn't start really causing problems. I should have made this loop a little bit better. There we go. Yeah. It's like right around here. We're going to move this over. Nope, that's an upside down 4. Okay. So it doesn't really start to be a problem until you're at about 40 millimeters of mercury for pressure. Did I write it backwards again?
No, just still trying to wrap my head around millimeters of mercury.
Anyway. Oh, okay. Yeah, it is an interesting thing. So basically what this loop is telling us is that as you increase pressure of oxygen within the blood, at normal pressure, so like 102, you're basically at 100% saturation of your hemoglobin. Makes sense. That's what you want it to be at. The cool thing is your hemoglobin really likes oxygen. So it doesn't stop, like oxygen preferentially binds to the hemoglobin and then diffuses into the blood plasma and stays there until you're reaching around kind of like 40-ish pressure units of O2. So that's really important because if you have someone who, say their saturation level is like, I don't know, this one's like around 75-80%. Like if their percent saturation rate is at 75%, there's a chance that it's just going to drop super quickly because your body's like, oh no, I don't have enough oxygen. Hemoglobin starts releasing it really quickly because you're getting a buildup of CO2. And then you just go super quickly and then you're dead.
I see.
So there are some interesting things. Let me fix up. Let's curve. Great. So there are some things that can happen in your body that will shift your curve to the left. Just kidding, that's the right. Or shift it to the left. I wish I could just end there, but no. So some of the things that do that, if you have respiratory or if you have any kind of alkalosis, what that means is you have your blood is more basic, so your pH is a little high. So the way that works is you have, essentially what that means is you are, alkalosis, pH is really low, not pH, your hydronium content is really low. So you have low amount of hydrogen. So you start breathing really quickly. So that brings in more oxygen and it reduces the amount of carbon dioxide that you have within your body. What happens is because you are now pushing in more oxygen, that means you are having more oxygen binding to hemoglobin because you just have more oxygen. So then you're just going to have a higher percentage of saturation faster because you're breathing faster. On the other hand, if you have some kind of acidosis where you have a ton of hydrogen in your blood, that's going to shift and end up causing a lot of CO2. And if you have a ton of CO2, more of your hemoglobin is going to end up being in that tensed state because carbon dioxide binds to the hemoglobin, turns it into the tense state. If it's in the tense state, oxygen can't bind to it. So that leads to a lower saturation amount. So this curve could represent something like an acidosis, and this one could represent something like an alkalosis. That's just a couple of the things that can cause shifts.
Okay.
And that's it for that section. Okay, so now we're going to talk, this is the second half of lungs, which is part 2 overall. So we're going to talk about the second part of part 2. Lungs. So we're going to talk about the pressures of CO2 within the blood, pressures of oxygen with the blood. We're going to talk about alveolar gas equation, which is this fun thing. And we're going to talk about ventilation, perfusion ratios, this stuff, and then we'll go from there. So for this part, we're going to talk about why this is a really useful equation. So this PaO2 stands for the pressure of oxygen within the alveoli. And so for a normal person, that is somewhere around like 100 to like 105. That's weird. Okay, so for this example, I'm just using 102. Where this number comes from is this equation. So what happens is at sea level, pressure is measured at 760 millimeters of mercury. The percentage of oxygen of the air is about 21%. So this FiO2, that determines the portion of pressure that is in the air. That comes from Dalton's law of partial pressures. Where's my marker? Basically, Dalton's law of partial pressures says that the total pressure is equal to the pressure of something A plus the pressure of something B, and so on. So in this case, the total pressure, which is our 760, is equal to the partial pressure of all of the things that make up the air. And so our partial pressure of oxygen is 21% of this, which ends up being about 160. So every time we breathe in, depending on your elevation, you're breathing in about 160 millimeters of mercury of O2, because we consider gases in terms of pressure rather than number of molecules. So we breathe that in. This next part, so there's our atmospheric pressure. This minus 50, that tells you about, so if you remember, the alveoli is lined with fluid. And so that fluid kind of like tries to pull in some of the oxygen that you breathe in. So kind of like, basically like, think of like sticky hands. They like kind of just grab it. And so that removes a portion of the O2 that you breathe in. So that drops it to about 149. So you lose like 11 pressure forces amount.
Reasonable.
Yeah. So you end up there. And then what this part says, so this stands for PCO2 over what I have as 0.85. So the PCO2 tells you the amount of pressure of CO2 and this. Basically what this is telling you about is you've got some amount of oxygen here, but some of it is already leaving and participating in gas exchange as you're breathing in. So this oxygen's coming in here, but that pressure isn't accounted for this stuff because that stuff has been replaced by CO2. And so that accounts for the other loss of this around 40 or so. So that gets us to our average alveolar pressure of 102. And so that tells us the pressure in here and also the same pressure in here. Because this is how much pressure you have to put in to prevent more oxygen from coming out. Because we want to keep oxygen in the blood. So equalized pressures. Pressure inside the alveoli for oxygen is 102. Same thing for the pressure on the blood side. And so this kind of more explains like at the end of the blood within the lungs. So say you're going through like some alveoli, you're starting at 40 and then you're going to go up to like 50 and then you're going to go past the next alveoli and you're going to hit like 60 and then the next set and you're going to hit like 70 and then so on. So by the time that you leave the lungs, the pressure of oxygen within the blood is that 102. Super cool. Because there's no way you're going to get all of this into the blood within this really short time frame because you're pumping your blood all the time really, really quickly.
Yeah.
So that was Dalton's law of partial pressures. Henry's law says as you put pressure, so imagine we kind of have like a plunger here and we're pushing down. As we increase the pressure here, we increase the amount of oxygen that ends up being within the blood. So this 760 is really important because that's what pushes this 102 millimeters of mercury into the blood.
That makes sense.
Really, really important. But if we decrease the amount, that means you're going to have less oxygen in the blood. So this is why in cases of, like you're in high altitude places, like if you're climbing the Himalayas, that's why we really worry about oxygen, is because you have so much less pressure, you're not getting as much oxygen into your blood. Okay.
So it's not really a problem with like you're breathing slowly or something like that. It's just that there's
there's literally
so
just
little pressure.
there's literally
Just
just
getting
less oxygen.
Okay.
So that's why we say there's less oxygen. In reality, it's just more of like there's less pressure pushing oxygen into your body.
Okay. Cool.
Okay, so if you have an alveolar gas equation, we talked about this. This R, it's kind of a weird thing. It's basically tells you how many carbon dioxides and how many oxygens you are using and producing based off of what's happening in your metabolism. So if you're breaking down like carbs, you're going to have a relatively equal rate of oxygens and carbon dioxides. Whereas if you're breaking down like proteins or fats, you're going to have a higher amount of CO2 that you're producing, and you're going to use a whole lot more oxygen. So overall, that ends up being somewhere in the realm of like 0.82 to like 0.87. So we average that to 0.85. So that's all of this. And this is really useful because we can use this calculation based off of what we know the pressure is outside to determine what your alveolar pressure here should be and what the pressure inside the blood should be. And if there's a difference, then we know that something is going on. Perhaps there's some kind of clot, perhaps there's some kind of scarring that's preventing gas exchange. Maybe you're in some kind of alkalosis or acidosis. Something that's causing the oxygen in here to not make it into the blood. Okay, where'd the cap go for that marker? Oh, here it is. Okay, so that's all that stuff. Next, we're going to talk about ventilation and perfusion equation. So this V stands for the alveolar ventilation. So that's essentially how much fresh oxygen air we're getting in here per breath or per minute. And then the flow rate is how much blood is moving past each alveoli going through the lungs. So usually for each liter of air that we breathe in into the alveoli, there's about 200 milliliters of oxygen in there. So around 20%, which matches up with around 21% of the air. Great. Within blood, it should be about that same. So that one ends up being, for every liter of blood, we have around 200 milliliters of oxygen. Great. Our lungs are kind of weird. So if you remember my beautifully anatomically correct drawing of a lung, we have different lobes. So we've got a superior, middle, and inferior lobe of the lung. Interestingly enough, air will settle down in the bottom of the lobe, the lower lobes first, then the top lobe. So your perfusion rate is actually higher down below because you get more air as you travel up, your flow rate, your rate of alveolar ventilation decreases because the air fills in the bottom first and then goes up. But on average, it ends up being around 0.8. So that's the ratio of the gas inside the alveoli to the oxygen inside the alveoli to the oxygen inside the blood. So it's like, maybe because you're going to breathe in like maybe 4 liters of oxygen in a minute and you're perfusing 4 to 5 liters of blood. So it's going to be around that like 0.8 to 0.1. That's fine. Great. The interesting thing is we're going to have a fun spectrum here. So here's our little happy 0.8. This is 0, and then this is, wow, that's just like another 8. Infinity. So V over Q, V over Q. So what would happen here if our Q gets really, really, really small? Our perfusion ratio basically goes to infinity. So as our perfusion ratio increases, usually that means something is happening to where we're not getting blood to the alveoli, or we're just not getting oxygen to the blood. Or we're actually just not filling the alveoli with air. So that could decrease our alveolar ventilation. So perhaps you've got some kind of blockage up here. So that's slowly decreasing. Oh, hang on, I'm doing that backwards. Just kidding. Forget I said that.
Okay.
We're going to do it better. It didn't make really that much sense anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's happening here is our Q is increasing. What that means, just kidding, Q is decreasing.
Okay.
Q decreases, perfusion increases. So if this decreases, that means for some reason our flow rate of blood is decreasing drastically. So that could be we have some kind of blockage and there's literally no blood getting past here. So that's like one extreme. On the other extreme, Q has gotten really, really big.
So like blood's flowing really fast?
Or V is just 0.
Okay.
So this is a really weird thing. So you can have either like no air coming in.
Like a blockage there.
Like a blockage here. Or you can have, so that flow rate refers to how much oxygen is passing through the blood. So how much of the blood is oxygenated. If you have something called shunting, basically what that is so you have the right atria of the heart, which takes in all of the blood from your body, and it's just a whole bunch of deoxygenated blood. If that immediately goes into the right atria instead of going to the lungs, you're now going to start pumping a bunch of deoxygenated blood throughout your body, which is really bad. But that means
makes sense.
Your Q becomes really, really big. Right? No, really small.
Really small.
Yeah.
Really small.
Brick, hang on. Gosh, this kind of stuff hurts my head trying to think about it. In this case, there's a blockage. There's no flow rate. Really small, really big number here. Great. In this case, we're making the flow rate really high, but we're shunting all of the blood, so none of it is being oxygenated. So this ends up being really this increases, this decreases. Decrease, increase. Yeah, so Q's getting really big when you just start shunting blood. So you're starting to move blood faster, but it's not getting oxygenated. So you end up getting a perfusion rate of around 0. So really bad. This means you're starting to shunt blood, so you're starting to move blood around that is deoxygenated. Or in this case, you're starting to get blockages. Make sense?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll have to look into it a little bit more to try to explain better. But for the purposes of this video, if your perfusion rate is closer to 0, that means you're starting to shunt blood. So it's moving, so it's basically avoiding the lungs. In this case, you have a complete blockage. Your Q has gone to 0. There is no oxygen getting into the blood. Cool. Okay. Now we're going to talk about part 2, pulmonary alveolar ventilation rates. Alrighty. This one's a fun one. Really gross. Makes my hand yucky. Okay. We're going to draw several alveoli. Okay. Okay, so essentially what I'm talking about here is we're going to talk about how the ventilation of your lungs works. So how much air you're moving in and out. So for a normal sized person who's resting at normal, each breath, so you breathe out and in, that volume that you breathe out and the volume that you breathe in is around 500 milliliters. About half a liter of air that you're breathing in and out. Awesome. So in your lungs, we're going to talk a little bit about anatomy of the lungs. So you have what's called the tracheal or bronchial tree. Really, really cool, actually. So you have your trachea, turns into primary bronchi, and then those turn into secondary bronchi, and then those turn into tertiary bronchi, and then those turn into terminal bronchioles. Each of those segments does not participate in gas exchange. So any air that's in there can't go into the blood. It doesn't work like that. After the terminal bronchioles, then you get to what's called respiratory bronchioles, and then the alveolar ducts and the alveoli. At that point, then you can start having gas exchange. So anything that is in the terminal bronchioles to your trachea is in what's called anatomical dead space. So that air is not being used at all. Whoop-de-doo, it's useless. Cool. Not really, but it's there. So that ends up being around 150 milliliters, depending on your size. So if you're a really big person, that could be maybe around 200, maybe 220. If you're a smaller person, it might be a little smaller, but average 150. Cool. So at the top of your inhale, this is filled, gas exchange has happened, you have 150 milliliters of dead space. So then you start to exhale. So you move that 150 out, but we also need to push out another 350 because each time we breathe out 500 milliliters. So we breathe out this 150 in dead space and then another 350 outside of that. And then we fill up this dead, that's a backwards 5. We fill up that dead space again with another 150 that was participating in gas exchange.
So that's CO2 then?
Yes.
Is that dead space?
Correct. So this dead space is now CO2. We don't like it. So then we start to inhale. This one's exhaling. Exhale. So when you inhale, you pull in that 150, but then you also pull in another 500 because that's your normal resting breathing rate. So you end up pulling in 350 fresh air, and then you fill up that dead space with 150 milliliters of fresh air, but it's in dead space, so it doesn't do anything. Completely useless. So what you can appreciate is each time you're breathing in and out, instead of getting a full 500, you're only getting a portion of that.
Yeah.
So say you're breathing for, maybe your breath rate is like 12 breaths per minute. And this is 500 milliliters per breath. That ends up being 6,000 milliliters of air that's just going into your lungs and out of your lungs per minute. But only 350 of that is actually useful air. So that ends up being 4,200 milliliters of fresh air. So our pulmonary ventilation is 600 milliliters, but our alveolar ventilation, which is how much oxygen we're actually getting and using, is that 4,200 milliliters per minute.
It's kind of inefficient.
Yes, but we have to have some way to get air in and out.
Mm.
So what's interesting is if you start hyperventilating, so you have like really quick but shallow breaths, you're actually only going to end up moving maybe like 300. Your tidal volume is going to go to 300. You're only moving 300 in, 300 out. So if you move 150 out,
but the dead air is just going to be the same. So
dead air is going to be the same. So you're only moving 150 milliliters of oxygenated air each time. And maybe you increase your breathing rate to like, I don't know, maybe 30. So we take our 15, multiply by 30. I'm going to use a calculator right now. Go on, calculator. Calculator.
15 times 30 is 450.
So 150 times our 30, not 930. ends up being 4,500. Maybe you're not breathing quite that fast. That'd not be good. So you're breathing at like 20. So 150 times 20. That's only getting you 3,000 milliliters. So if you start breathing shallow and really rapid, the amount of oxygen that you're getting significantly drops. That's a no bueno. But say you start to, get control of yourself and you start to slower but deeper breaths. So now you're increasing your tidal volume to let's say you're moving in 700 milliliters per breath. And now you've dropped your breathing instead of 15 to say 10. So now you take your 700, multiply it by 10. So now you're moving in 7,000 milliliters of your, oh, actually, hang on. We take this, subtract our 150. 150, that ends up being what, 550? Yeah. So we take our 550, multiply it by our 10 per minute. So it ends up being 5,500 milliliters per minute. So if you're breathing normally, if you start breathing shallow and rapid, it doesn't really help too much. You're actually getting less oxygen because you're pulling in less air and you're just moving that dead space around a whole lot. Doesn't really help. But if you take in slow, deep breaths, you pull in more air overall, which means you're ending up to pull in more oxygenated air. Hence increasing your alveolar ventilation, which is what we want. That's the air that we can use.
So there isn't a method to just get rid of that
dead space?
Or to reduce the dead space. You're just increasing the ratio between the two, between usable air and
dead space. Yeah. So shallow rapid breathing means you're bringing in a smaller portion of oxygenated air, and you're actually just keeping a larger portion of that as just that dead space. But if you take slower, deeper breaths, so you increase your tidal volume, more of that portion ends up being oxygenated rather than that dead space you keep moving around. Okay. Oh my gosh. Now all the calculators pop up. Anyway.
Very interesting.
Okay. The final thing that we're going to talk about is COPD and restrictive lung diseases. So this goes to something actually super cool. We're going to talk about pressure volume loops again, but this time it's going to be about the lung. So we're going to draw pressure down here, and then we're going to talk about volume up here. So as a lung, you breathe in, and then you breathe out. And then it kind of goes along that normal way. What can happen is, say you have something that's like this, where it's really like that, or potentially down here. So if you increase your pressure a lot while inhaling, but your volume isn't really changing, this increased pressure a lot, volume doesn't change. This is what we call a very high... Okay, I'm going to have to splice that. Okay, so continuing where I left off. So we've got... Gosh, I have to hold it up here and stuff. This hurts. So we've got our pressure down here, volume up there. Normal lung, we increase volume as we increase pressure, and then we decrease volume as we decrease pressure. That's what your normal lung should look like. In this case, we're not really decreasing pressure as we increase volume. So that means that we have, just kidding, that is this one is your high elastance. High elastance. So elastance is that resistance to stretch. So you have What?
Sorry, I'm just astounded that you're writing upside down, backwards, and left-handed at the same time.
Thanks. That actually is legible.
Yes, sort of, but yeah.
Anyway, going on. So, the high elastance, so your lung, the elastance is resistance to stretch. So your lung, you can fill it up with a lot of volume, but it doesn't stretch a whole lot. So that would be a case where it is actually really hard to breathe in, but really, like, it's normal to breathe out. This down here is what we call compliance. Oh, compliance. My one mistake. So, compliance is kind of like, it's the opposite of elastance. So your lung is really stretchy, but has a hard time going back to what it was. So I like to think of elastance as you take a rubber band, you stretch it, and you can feel like the force of it trying to go back. It'd be like a really, really thick rubber band, super tight. Whereas the compliant lung is like the really, really long, super sad, old rubber bands. Like, you can stretch it a ton, and it's like, it goes back to its normal shape, like, really slowly, if at all. So that's your compliant lung. A good example, so compliant lungs are really hard to breathe out. You can breathe in just fine because your lung, like, cool. But then, because it's not so elastic anymore, it doesn't go back, so it's really hard to breathe out. So that's something that would be what's called a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. Something where it's hard to breathe out. Good example of that would be something maybe kind of like, is it chronic bronchitis? That's something like that? No. This would be more like emphysema. So emphysema is an interesting one. Actually, we'll talk about that in a little second. Elastance, this would be something like chronic bronchitis, where you have a bunch of buildup of stuff. I'm not even entirely sure what it is. You have an inflammation of your bronchioles. So they're normal tube, kind of like this, and then they get tighter. And so it's harder to pull air in. So that would be something where you have a really high elastance. You have to put in a ton of pressure to get not a lot of volume. So emphysema, we're going to talk about more about emphysema. Emphysema is an interesting thing. So we're going to draw like one alveolus, and then maybe like another, and then like another. Great. And then they all go up, and then they're happy.
Anatomically correct.
Thank you. You can smell the marker really strongly now. So what emphysema does is it starts to break down the sides of the alveolar walls, and it kind of just makes like one really big alveolus. And if you remember, we have our fun equation, 2t over, that's backwards, r. So what we've done is we have dramatically increased the radius. And so this is equal to pressure, which means we significantly dropped that. So this means it's real easy to pull air in. But because the pressure is so low, it's hard to push it back out.
Oh, okay.
So your emphysema is a COPD, so obstructive disorder. So it's easy to pull stuff in, but it's really hard to push out. And so that is emphysema. And that describes what's called air trapping, where air kind of just gets stuck in here and then can't leave. And there's a chance if you have the chronic bronchitis long enough, it can cause scarring, and it can make it really hard to breathe out as well. And that can also cause some air trapping. We don't like air trapping because we go through gas exchange, we get O2, we pull CO2 in, but then CO2 just stays. And then this starts causing a lot of problems. This will start to cause, if you increase CO2, you're going to start shifting to the right in a fun equation, and you're going to start causing an acidosis. This is really bad. We don't want acidosis. Then we die.
Okay.
And so that is COPD and restrictive lung diseases. Restrictive lung diseases will cause your elastance, kind of like that chronic bronchitis. Yeah, that's it.